Buongiorno tutti. My name is Joe, and I will be your representative for Italian GCSE for A-Languages. I got a grade 9 in Italian not too long ago, and this is a walkthrough of the GCSE Italian writing paper for Higher Tip. Although this information, other than question structure, will also apply to Foundation Tip. I'm going to go through exam technique to answer questions, how long to spend on each question, as well as useful phrases and grammar. First will be the general information you need to know for the exam, then we'll move on to example questions/answers, as well as advice for each one. This is specific to the Edexcel exam board, but there will be slight differences for AQA that I will point out as relevant. This is the general information for the actual context of the exam. This will be on the front page of the exam booklet, but it's nice to know it beforehand. So you will have 1 hour and 50 minutes for AQA, or 1 hour and 20 minutes for Edexcel, excluding extra time. This includes enough time to read the questions, answer them, then check them at the end. From my experience, you will often finish a lot earlier than the designated time, but this is definitely not a bad thing, as you'll have ample time to catch silly mistakes or even rewrite paragraphs if you're not happy with them. There is a total of 60 marks, and I will show you how each question divvies those out when explaining each question. This is 25% of the total grade, as you would expect, given that there are 4 papers. In total, there are 3 questions, 2 essays of varying word count, and 1 translation from English to Italian. So what exactly are the examiners looking for? If you look on the specification or the mark scheme, you might be overwhelmed by the rubric they use, but really it can be boiled down to just a few points. First, complex grammatical structure/language. This includes varied verbs and varied verb tenses, extended sentences using a range of grammar, so like conjunctions, pronouns, or other similar structures, and justified arguments. This doesn't mean you can't get a good mark without these things, but making sure you have maybe a few different word tenses and putting your own opinions in there will definitely improve your mark. Next is concise and understandable content. A lot of students assume that if you make one mistake that will cost you a mark, and this is not necessarily true. It largely depends on what kind of mistake it is. So using the wrong verb tense is a mistake that hinders clarity, and so using a few of them will cost you. But simply using the wrong gender on words that are recognizable regardless, once or twice, is perfectly fine. Otherwise, making sure your actual content is good is a very important step. For each bullet point, you don't need to go into huge detail surrounding it, but making sure each bullet point links together is very important, making your writing comprehensible. Similarly, making sure what you're writing about is relevant is also crucial. This is something that they very recently started cracking down on, but it's important to mention. For example, if you start writing about the time you started a band with your friends on a question about your favourite type of music, you need to be careful to make sure you're linking that directly to the type of music you enjoy, not just trying to boost the word count with a vaguely similar subject. This is the first of the essay questions, and likely the one you will answer first. You might notice that you have options here. Depending on the exam board, you will either get 2 or 3 options to choose from. Make sure you only do one though, of course. They can be from any themes, but for AQA specifically, each of the 3 options will have one from each theme. The bullet points are not optional. They must be in your answer, though the spread of information does not need to be proportional. You can do 1 sentence on the first bullet point, then spend the rest on the others. That is perfectly fine as long as all 4 bullet points are covered. The mark for this question is out of 20 for Edexcel or 16 for AQA, which is just under to up to a third of the total marks, so not something insubstantial. Some people tend to assume that question 2 is the most important, and to some extent this is true, but make sure you do not forget to spend a good time on question 1. It is still very important. You will want to aim for 90 words. This doesn't mean you can't go over 90 words. Some people might tell you that examiners will stop reading after 90 and discredit the words after, but this is not true. The essays are marked holistically, i.e. positively, using all aspects of the essay. But definitely make sure to get up to 90 marks or fairly close to it. So around 86 will be fine, but may limit you as there's less likely to be complex language in there. Ideally, you would spend 25 minutes on this question. Have a go at answering this question yourself before continuing on. The next slide will show an answer that I've written myself. Here is an answer that I've written to the exam question earlier. As you can see, I've highlighted parts that examiners will be looking for. In green are the different verb tenses, which include a few things. Later, I will go into which tenses you'll need, as well as this phrase here, penso che sia. The tenses I've used include the present indicative, the present subjunctive, the past perfect, and the conditional. Next, blue signifies opinions, which are very important to show both advanced language and complex sentence structure. Using phrases such as penso che, mi piace, and similar are great ways of inputting that in. Similar, sentence extenders help make your ideas more streamlined as well as give you some context marks for expanding your answers. Connectives such as perché or inoltre can really help with that. One thing I want to point out as well is that you can see that although I have answered all 4 bullet points, they're not of proportional length. The second bullet point that asked che cosa hai fatto l'estate scorso, I only use 12 words to answer, while the fourth bullet point that read che cosa ti piace fare durante le vacanze d'estate contains over 3 times that amount. Don't worry about making each bullet point equal. It's not important. Here is the second and final essay question on the exam, and it's very similar in format to question 1. Just as question 1 has 2/3 options, the same applies to question 2. For Edexcel students, the bullet points will also be similar to question 1, with 4 bullet points each. However, AQA students will only have 2 bullet points for question 2, though they will be a lot vaguer than those of question 1, so you will still have a lot to talk about. This question is worth more than question 1, being the largest question in the exam, with 28 or 32 for Edexcel and AQA respectively, so it's worth doing right. In general, all my advice for question 1 still applies, so if you haven't already, flip back to question 1 for notes on general exam technique. Ideally, you would spend 35 minutes on this question. Just like the 90-worder, if you want to answer the question yourself, go for it, foreseeing my example answer. This is about the length of a standard 150-word essay. As you can see, it's not actually all that long, but that's why you need to make sure you're using a wide range of verbs. For me, I like to stick to the present indicative, present subjunctive, continuous, conditional, past perfect, past imperfect, and imperfect subjunctive, though you can definitely get a good mark with using less tenses. Next, I've made sure to use lots of opinions, making sure that the reasoning isn't always just because it is plus an adjective, giving examples and past experiences to provide more content which works together with sentence extenders such as tuttavia or quindi to tie together simple sentences into complex ones. So what tenses will you actually be expected to know? You should definitely know il presente, the present. This is just the regular tense, i.e., I do, he is, we think, they watch. For example, vado in ristorante. Il passato prossimo, the perfect tense. Put simply, this is the past tense that you will largely use for most one-off actions. For example, I said, he saw, we gave, they went out. In this case, sono andato in ristorante. Next is the l'imperfetto, the imperfect, which is the other past tense you will need to know for GCSE, which represents ongoing completed actions like I used to be, she hoped, we used to think, they knew. An example would be andavo in ristorante. Il futuro semplice, the future, is one of the 2 future tenses, but the only one you really need to know, although you may be able to figure the other one out as we will go over later. For example, I will do, she will have, we are going to run, they are going to play. Similarly, you can say andrò in ristorante. Similarly to the future, incondizionale, the conditional, is used in situations where the outcome is hypothetical or not entirely sure. This would look like I would eat, he would sing, we would hide, they would dance. In this instance, andrei in ristorante. These are all the tenses you should definitely be able to at least recognize and be able to conjugate if need be. There are a lot of irregulars, but they are generally consistent as to which verbs will be irregular and which won't. For example, essere is usually irregular. Now, there are some other tenses which you could feasibly learn and would boost you up to the higher marks. These are very unlikely to come up in the translation and so are only really useful for the essays. These include il congiuntivo presente, the subjunctive. This is kind of a confusing tense as we don't really use it much as English, which is used when you are not sure about something or to represent an opinion, but would otherwise act like the regular present, so not like the conditional. I highly recommend that if you were to learn the tense, you don't learn it all, but only learn some very simple phrases, which I will highlight on the next slide. If you were to use it, it would look something like vada in ristorante. The next few tenses are basically just application of previous tenses by using the past participles, the atto, ito, uto parts of the perfect, plus the imperfect, conditional, and future to form different variations. Using this, we create the phrases I had been, she would have seen, we will have gone, and in Italian looks like ero, sarai, sarò, andato in ristorante. Finally, the last tense almost never comes up and is often confused with the present in English, but takes the role of il gerundio, the continuous, used when you are currently doing the action. You will very rarely use this in the essay, but can be used in translations in rare scenarios. Not really worth learning, but if you're great at verbs and want to know more, then why not? In English, we would read it as I am reading, he is jumping, we are fighting, they are drinking, while in Italian it would look like sto andando in ristorante. Remember that, although you can get away with not knowing some of the verb tenses for the essays, by just not using the tense or using set phrases like mi piacerebbe for the conditional, it's still a good idea to learn as much of them as possible, as the above ones can come up in either translation. This is the last thing I have to say on the essay questions, and basically consists on phrases that use difficult language like advanced verb tenses or other concepts. These can be used in your essay as an easy way to bump up those marks without having to learn anything more substantial. Think of it as like learning quotations in English literature. It's very similar in application. Penso che or credo che means I think that and needs to be followed by a subjunctive. See the earlier verb slide about what that is. But to make it easier, just using sia in place of a for it is, or siano in place of sono for they are, is enough. Make sure you're not using another verb like fare or avere if you were to use this phrase though, as otherwise you would need to conjugate that into the subjunctive, which is a lot more difficult. Pensavo che fosse or fossero is functionally the same as penso che sia, except it's in the past tense. Same thing goes here, except also don't confuse fosse and fossero with fare. They are still using essere, so they still mean it was or they were. Se avessi la scelta translate to if I had the choice, and works very well if you want to throw in some opinions alongside the fancy phrasing by using the imperfect subjunctive, a verb tense that you will probably never see unless you end up studying A-Level Italian, like me. Alongside it, you can use a conditional verb, but present tense works fine. Similarly, se dovessi scegliere means if I had to choose, so very similar to avessi la scelta, if you wanted to suggest that the choice is difficult or want to repeat the grammar without just recycling earlier phrases. C'è, ci sono, c'era, and c'erano all use essere plus ci, with ci in this instance meaning there to form there is or similar. You should probably already be familiar with them, but it's worth highlighting regardless. An example would look like Ci sono molte fabbriche nella mia zona to mean there are lots of factories in my zone. Dopo aver or prima aver by extension are ways of using the past perfect more fluently, essentially meaning after having done or before having gone, for example, using done or gone as the past participle. All you need to do is add a past participle to the end, though if the past participle is one that would ordinarily use essere in the past perfect, make sure you're using esser, which is essere without the last e, not aver, which is avere without the last e. Si può, si potrebbe, si deve, and si dovrebbe all fall into the same grammatical structure of the impersonal si. Essentially, it's like using the old-fashioned English pronoun one. For example, one does, or one thinks. In modern English, we would still use you, but don't get it confused. It's using the he, she, it conjugation in Italian. These phrases of one can, one could, one has to, and one should can be used in a variety of situations. For example, when describing a town, you could say, one can go to the park and play football. Or providing examples of things people can do to help the environment, one should pick up litter off the ground. Here is a past paper translation from an Edexcel paper. As you can see, it's not all that long and only worth 12 marks. Again, don't see that and assume it's not worth your time. It is still a considerable part of your exam. As you can see, this translation is from Italian to English, and this will always be the case, as the opposite will be on the reading paper. I would advise you to spend around 10 minutes on this question. This should add up to 1 hour 10 in combination with the other questions. The last 5/10 minutes should be used for checking your answers. For AQA specifically, half the question will be marked in parts. It will be split into around 12/13 segments with a total equating to 1 to 6 marks. This system is a double-edged sword, as on paper it means that several mistakes can cost you only 1 mark, but it can also mean that 2 small mistakes in 2 different segments also loses you out on potentially 2 marks. For the other 6 marks, it's all about your knowledge of language and structures, with almost flawless knowledge giving you top band, although some small mistakes are acceptable to still get those 6 marks. Otherwise, for Edexcel, the question will be marked based entirely on accuracy and fluency. Similarly to the essay questions, if you make small mistakes but they understand what you mean, that won't cost you too much marks. Here is your chance to pause the video and attempt this question. After a few seconds have passed, I will go over the correct answer and how I would have approached the question. Okay, let's begin. Alla fine settimana is the fancy way of saying at the weekend, but at a weekend is also fine. Lavorare is to work and isn't irregular, so conjugating that should be easy. However, in un ristorante could provide some issues, as you might be tempted to say nel ristorante, but be careful, as the question is using an indefinite article a, not a definite one there. This is a very easy mistake to make, which could end up being a crucial mistake, as it can hinder clarity. Non mi piace should be hardwired into you, but questo lavoro might not be. Questo and quello are adjectives, which means that it changes based on the noun, which mean this and that. Posso is irregular and is followed by an infinitive. Make sure you know which verbs need to be followed by infinitives or connectives. Another common mistake people make is not including the article when saying my something. Remember that you can only exclude it when talking about direct family. Again, you might be tempted to put either sabato scorso, but the article is not needed here, only sabato scorso. Luckily, this is a very minor mistake that doesn't hinder clarity, so it's not the end of the world. Ho finito using another tense is probably fine for you guys, but alle undici could be interesting. With time, you need to use feminine articles, as you are referring to the hours themselves, the Italian word for that being le ore. It may seem strange as most numbers end in O or I, which are usually masculine, but this is just a rule you need to remember. Like posso, voglio is followed by an infinitive, and continuare especially needs a connective a followed by an infinitive. Like I said earlier, usually you need to have an article when saying my, but family is an exception. Should be able to do lavoro per un giornale, fairly straightforward translating word for word, but spero also needs a connective as well as another infinitive, even if we don't really say that in the same way as English. And yes, this is not a mistake, un giornalista ends in an A even if the person, and therefore the article, is masculine. Additionally, like I said with al fine settimana, or al weekend, sometimes there will be multiple ways to say things, like how un posto di lavoro or un mestiere are other words for job. And that's all. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully some of my advice has been helpful. Good luck in your exams, both real and mocks. You're going to do great. Any questions, leave a comment, check out some other videos. In bocca al lupo. Ciao ciao.